Does your kata practice look nothing like your sparring? Ever wondered why the techniques that look so powerful in forms feel impossible to land in a match? Welcome to Great Karate Myths, Debunking the Legends. Today, we're challenging a core assumption, the idea that you can free spar with antique kata. We'll explore why these ancient forms, especially with weapons, were never designed for a kickboxing style exchange, and how the true methods of practice got lost in translation. Stay with us. Okay, so Tom, did sparring ruin everything? Everything.
Wow. Nearly. Yeah. With the antique form, certainly that it seems to be the case that the idea of some sort of sparring or free play with the contents of those forms wasn't something that was in mind when they were put together as manuals of systems or more, and they're also things that can't be sparred with. So if you take an antique form that's sai or bow or tonfa or butterfly sword or something like that, you can't really spar with them. And you can see attempts in modern kabuto of trying to spar with those sorts of tools, but it tends to become quite limited and often takes lead from something like Kendo and becomes sort of point-based, and sparring with weapons isn't really reflective of the impact of what the weapons would do if a blow was landed or if you were struck by a bow or tonfa or something like that. So it becomes something in of itself. So sparring with weapons becomes a mod is to what Kendo is to fighting with real swords. They're two completely different things. And so, sparring isn't something that should exist there. And there are interesting attempts to create kata-based sparring, but it's just something that doesn't really. It always ends up with being MMA, and not all of the the katas, the antique forms, certainly weren't driven towards cage fighting. So that's the kind of premise of sparring ruins everything. It's a bit of a joke there, but what we're really talking about is kata with very specific functions created to be used in specific contexts, and sparring wasn't a method that was necessary or useful for those types of practices.
Do we want to define sparring? Let's define what we mean by sparring, first of all.
Well, sparring in karate typically is putting on some added gloves and foot pads and shin pads, and it's kind of like kickboxing. So you're not really going for you're not knocking each other out, and you're trying to skillfully land punches and kicks and maybe the odd throw or something like that and move into grappling. But it's something that's you do for a couple of minutes and and that's it, and no one really gets hurt. So there's an agreement that you're not really going for knockouts or arm breaks or anything like that. It's a kind of ongoing exchange, and the idea is to kind of use all your basics, your kicks, your punches, and all the rest of it. I think that's kind of karate sparring, loosely summed up.
An exchange of strikes.
Yeah, but it's not really reflective of a fight, and it's not really reflective of kata. So it's become a thing in of itself. It's another form of karate.
Well, I think you could probably go as far to say that if sparring is your thing, if getting the pads on and having at it with somebody else is your thing, you may as well just completely disregard the kata, because it's waste of time if what you're interested in doing is sparring. Because as you pointed out, the two are entirely different things.
Yeah. I think that's what happened in some styles as well, and they kind of abandoned the kata, rightly so, and focused on sparring and, you know, somewhere in between light continuous and full contact. um, so I think I think absolutely right. I think a good example is the Japanese bujutsu systems, like, and we've talked about the Jodo before, which we both practiced previously, Matt, and you couldn't spar in it. You can only do fixed routines and try to add, some spice into that. You couldn't spar with it. There's no way you would be able to use the techniques. And I'm not for or against it being really effective in the real world or anything like that. I'm not talking about that, but just within the content of Jodo, Shindomuzo Ryu Jodo, which is a short staff versus a sword, mainly, you couldn't spar with it. It just wouldn't work. So, and it's the same, I think the same principle for the antique forms, where you've got bow and you've got sai and you've got swords and you've got tonfa and things like that. You just can't spar with them effectively. You'd have to almost create an entirely new practice in order to do some, which is what's essentially happened in Kobudo, and the Kobudo sparring is becoming something new is being made up for that, for it to be point-based bow sparring or something like that. So yeah,
I mean, I think that's a good observation, actually. Whenever sparring enters the mix, you do end up having to restrict things quite a lot. You end up not just having like a sort of gentleman's agreement that you're going to abide by certain rules, but you end up having to restrict techniques that are possible, just to, because people want that competitive element. I mean, look at what happened to Kendo. It bears almost no visible relationship to like Kenjutsu or anything like that. It becomes tippy tappy, and who can wave the shinai quicker. So it inevitably goes on. If you start with these older techniques, it inevitably goes down the line of more and more of a narrow focus.
I think when you've got classical systems that are based in preemption and going first as well, you have to. So what underpins some of the antique kata is that the intention is to go first. You're not setting up a kind of confrontation or anything like that. The idea is to completely overwhelm, go first and go fast, and that is not compatible with sparring in any way, because the second that you're sparring, you don't have the element of surprise or the type of skill that you need to cultivate to be effective preemptively is something that's very, very different from an exchange in sparring or something like that. And I think that also exists in the Tendo kata as well, as you're practicing something that's quite contained and very, very, the function's been recorded very, very clearly, and it doesn't quite work once you break out of it. You lose the form. You lose the not that form is that important to adhere to when it's being applied, for real preemptively or something like that. But you lose the fundamental structure of the preemption type techniques and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, well, if the idea of the technique is preemptive and going first, then the very notion of having a sparring bout is completely wrong, isn't it? Because once you've got into that kind of exchange of blows, you've already lost completely the idea of going first and squashing any kind of dispute straight away. It wouldn't be very exciting to watch, would it? Like sparring often is.
Yeah. See, the structure of it completely changes once you start free sparring or attempting to do something within that sort of remit, which is really born out of boxing and kickboxing. It's not something that grappling. You have sparring, if you like, free grappling, because you can, but the kind of form-based martial arts traditionally. The sparring's been adopted from boxing and kickboxing, and that's where it's most effective, is actually within those arts as opposed to form-based arts, which I think that other types of practice are necessary for them to be functionally effective. And sparring isn't one of them.
No, definitely not.
Nathan, what are your thoughts?
Well, there's a confusion. I think the term sparring is in itself problematic. So when that term is used, that minds may be reflected to or on sort of ancient Greek or Roman boxing, even pancration, which pancration, fighting with spike gloves. Well, look, I won't go there, but I think sparring really is confused or conflated. Is it a sport or is it a means of combat training? And in it, it's an extremely vague term. So we everyone that hears it, not everyone, but most that hear it, think they know what it means, but I'm not sure that they do, or that we can, because it's you can look for a dictionary definition, but it's never here. So purpose of this discussion. An exchange of blows, unrehearsed, unchoreographed, between two opponents, could be suffice for a basic explanation for sparring. And as Matt and both Matt and Tom have made it clear, not really much to do with the kata, but I think that looking at the it's something that we can only seriously consider with unarmed fighting. Despite the fact that people like me, I mean, Tom's from Tom's has great accomplishments in karate. There's no question. And but he's from a generation that had the luxury of pads and gloves and things like that. And I'm from a generation that got more bloody noses and bruises and stuff because the I'm not pulling rank, but those pads we didn't have. They didn't exist. They came later. But the fact is, there was an immense frustration amongst the people that I trained and practiced with, and who shared my love of karate, that we couldn't make the techniques in the kata work in free sparring. We can never make them work in the free for all, the rough and tumble of sparring. And in fact, we all knew the rough and tumble really well because we'd grown up that way. As a schoolboy in England had when I grew up, had lots of rough and tumble. So the rough and tumble we already knew, and then along came karate, and that was great. Look at that! It's exciting. It's awesome. It's impressive. It's even got kicks and so here so how do we rough and tumble with that? So, but we didn't need to guess too much because most karate was doing it, with the notable exception of the Shotokai school, which I mentioned before. But the frustration was that in formally learning karate, we were taught kata. And it was impossible to get those kata movements into the rough and tumble of sparring. Now, as I said, the English schoolboys, we were not inexperienced with rough and tumble sparring, largely based on boxing, of course, because that's how we were raised. And when I boxed in the police cadets in England, when I was a cadet, and none of my martial art experience was of any use at all at that time in the boxing training and the matches I engaged in. So the fact is that sparring, as Tom and Matt have already basically made clear, can have nothing to do with the kata, and therefore must be something outside of the tradition, the training, and its purpose.
I suppose, when looking at it from the kata perspective, is then if sparring isn't an element of the old forms, the older kata, then how do you practice the content? I think that's one of the main things I think that we'll get asked is, well, if you don't spar with it, if you're not doing anything, what are you doing with it? And I think there are ways to practice, but I think it varies from form to form. So if you take something like Kusanku, which has got this disarming bow, you've got a whole body of techniques there, and depending on where you make contact or grab the bow or engage the person, you have a technique for that. So if you're square on or standing next to them, and so on and so on. So you can practice proactive drilling where you grab and work the techniques, but there's nothing particularly interactive. So there isn't absolutely no sparring, but you can work with someone who's offering resistance, and you can get pretty good at those techniques and explore those techniques. And the other thing that you can do is produce a piece of choreography, which you can also layer in as well. So you can do something, you can do either or there. Those are two ideas. But yeah, it's being experimenting with them, and choreography can actually be quite an interesting way of exploring the function of the forms, but it's limited in that respect because you are dealing with a weapon, and so drilling as well is another way of doing it. But with sparring, you'd have to be so careful, and you want to avoid that because you need to be able to put some oomph into it, if you like. And if you've got to dampen that or it'll be too careful, it just doesn't quite work with a kata like Kusanku. And it's the same with something like Pasai, where you're hanging on to your weapon. So someone's trying to grab your bow. So you can do something a little bit interactive with that, where someone will come and try to grab the bow staff, and you are, depending where they grab the bow or you use the technique from Pasai. But again, you could do it as drills, or choreography, but you couldn't do much more than that, as far as I can tell anyway. So those are some things that you can do in the absence of sparring being a useful method for exploring the antique forms.
Well, I think that there also excuse me. I think there also needs to be a distinction made between useful drills and responses versus choreography that late in a later period became or was designed for demonstrative persons to give to please crowds or to draw crowds, and so I think a lot of the choreography that we've seen over the years in karate or many martial arts are sort of crowd pleasing is crowd pleasing material and bears little resemblance to anything that's practical or useful, and the majority of experienced martial artists understand this and know this, and yet they accept it. They accept that this kind of I suppose it's a corruption, really, because they want to further their arts and their groups, their styles, and their clubs, and draw in and attract and draw in people, members, students. But the choreographed material just became a mainstay of martial arts. Sort of massive collective tropes that ended up which ended up being in films. And then they became the norm. So long exchanges, complicated techniques, and the weirder and stranger they were, and many of us, myself included, loved that and enjoyed that in the films. And obviously, I have to mention Jackie Chan, amazing choreography, because the man was is an unbelievable athlete, I suppose. But this is what became accepted as martial arts. But then, or as kung fu or karate. But anyone trying, meanwhile, for want of a lazy expression, meanwhile back at the ranch, the rank and file of us trying to apply kata without rearranging were suffering catastrophic failure. It always ended up being bouncing around on the balls of the toes, and it ended up being reverse punch and slap blocks and front kick and side kick and round kick, none of which are really in the kata, and little else, dodging away from attacks, and all of it in a sort of a quasi boxing format. And I repeat, there was intense, well, for some of us anyway, frustration that we couldn't apply. We had all these magnificent kata with all these intricate techniques, and we could never get it into the free sparring. and I'll make this point that Funakoshi Jichin Sensei had no interest in free sparring, and I I'm not a mind reader, but I can guess why. But in my own view is that free sparring ruins the classical art, not because the classical art is inadequate, but it ruins it because it's got nothing whatsoever to do with the classical art. And I'll rest my case for a moment there and let you guys back in.
Do you think there was something lost in translation in the word kumite? Because it doesn't
literally mean sparring? Do you think it was something lost in translation with what the Western world considered sparring?
Well, kumite simply means kumite. It just means meeting hands or hands that are connecting. So it means that there are two people and something is happening between them in contact, as opposed to kata performance, solo kata performance. That's really all it means, and the term itself can't really describe any kind of combat or fighting. So it would be a question of how that should or could be usefully what could be extrapolated from it. What does it mean, in other words, apart from just meeting hands? It could be argued that, well, it's simple. It just means there's contact happening, and I think that is probably all it means. But it doesn't in itself lead to any insight into how an exchange between two karate practitioners could be achieved using all of the traditional movements derived from the kata.
I think there's also, if you look at K1 in its heyday, and certainly karate combat today, which is sort of the pinnacle really of where sparring can lead, that's absolutely nothing to do with what was going on in Okinawa. And so there's no relationship between sparring and what was I think you're right, Sinead, that there certainly might be mistranslation or misappropriation of the term kumite as well, as a kind of connecting things which are not really connected. So what kumite may have been used, the term may have been describing as, late 19th, early 20th century Okinawan practices of these arts, is absolutely nothing to do with the kind of elite fighting in K1 or karate combat or even karate competitions, with the fighters like Frank Brennan and people like that. It's just worlds apart. So it's a kind of a very loose, generalized term, which we talked about on the last episode, kind of putting things into history or connecting things in history from the modern day, which weren't really there back in the day, if you like. And I think kumite and the kind of connections with sparring might be one of those things. This idea that they were meeting hands and exchanging techniques ballistically and all the I think it's just not true. There's no evidence for it, and it seems that all came a lot later. And yeah, I suppose you can only speculate on how the antique forms were originally practiced and used. Performative was certainly one of them, and so the choreography is certainly there. But the practical skill side, as I said, we can only speculate. But you don't see even that. No one's arrived at Kusanku in sparring either. So this amazing development that's taken place in sparring, no one's arrived at any of the antique forms through the thousands and thousands of hours and fights and things like that. No one's arrived at Kusanku's a really good idea for that or something, or it's very much of its in and of itself.
But what this suggests is that they're two completely different things. Completely different things. I remember seeing a contemporary in terms of time period signing one of then of Shotokan, who was an England national and was in at the university dojo, and he was sparring with someone. I thought, this guy's really good. And I'm not trying to praise Simon here at all. It's actually, to be transparent here, he's a personal friend. So, but I'm not promoting him at all. I'm saying that I name him because he's from that sort of Frank Brennan generation of first class Shotokan karate practitioners, and just watching the sparring was just pure poetry, and it was so different from the stuff that it's not that I didn't know about Shotokan, because I did, but I'd been sidelined by my exploration of Goju Ryu at that time, and of course I was a massive Wing Chun fan, and watching Simon sparring was impressive, because the Shotokai that I'd experienced and the early karate that I had experienced was not as developed as in terms of sparring. In fact, Shotokai had no, and still has, no free sparring. But the and the karate I'd experienced really did not have the sophisticated sparring I saw Simon engaged in. In other words, I looked at that and I thought, this guy's good. This is great. What is this? And I think that looking at the history of karate sparring, we find it really across the board as something that was inevitable. It had to happen due to the randori, the free fighting of judo. Here are judo techniques that you can do as drills, but then you know what? We've got competition, so one person against another. Isn't that what Budo is all about, chaps? Maybe was the thinking, and Kenjutsu became Kendo. And as Matt said, they're tapping each other, on the head in the end, but it's probably not what the Iken Hitachi, one hit, one kill of swordsmanship might have been about. And in the same way, sparring is not about the outcome desired by or pursued with the original Kata. So my point was that watching the sparring, it was impressive, but I'll go back to my earlier point. It's got nothing whatsoever to do with Kata, and it is not possible to get Kata into a non-arranged free flow situation where you can just use all of those techniques spontaneously, unless you've got a format, which leads me on to what Koryu was ultimately all about. Because what we realized was that the only way that such a thing could be achieved was to use touch reflex. If everything was in contact, like the judo players, that they were feeling what to do, these judo players, as they're called, are in contact, physical contact. And we realized that the only way one could work out what was needed, what to do, would not be by a visual reflex, i.e. looking and thinking or instinctively reacting, which is still, a part of modern karate, and that's something that we've covered in Tenno-kata. But the only way that kata could be applied spontaneously, according to the need of the attack or what's happening would be in contact, would be by touch, reflex, like physical contact, and that is how we ended up training in the way that we do, and following the system that we do.
Well, I think we might just want to be clear there that what we're not talking about is free-flowing, spontaneous application of the antique forms of the Sai Kata, of the the Kusanku, the Pasai. That's not what we're talking about, because we don't do that.
Oh, sorry, it's just one for me. Okay, yeah, no, of course. If we have to understand that most of the the kata that we the antique kata, as we call them, are actually involved with weapons. So you're quite right, Matt, that there's no way you can have a continuous exchange of flow of techniques with weapon-based material. Absolutely correct. So I think I was really talking about Kodoru, which uses a modified sanchin, the one created by Miyagi Chojun Sensei, and his Rokushu or Tensho kata, and of course Naihanchin, which is grappling only. So the Kodoru system is based on touch reflex or contact reflex, grappling and counter grappling techniques, which and thank you for that clarification, have nothing whatsoever to do with the weapon function in the original. For instance, the Weichi Sanchin, Seisan, Sanseryu, or the counter to bow techniques in the Kusanku, or the retaining of bow of one's own bow staff in other kata.
I think the closing point on it was that sparring within karate is another art of karate. So there are lots of arts of karate, and I think sparring and free fighting has become one of them. Is one strain of karate. It's such a general term. It doesn't just mean the antique forms, but it's nothing to do with, I think, the core point of today, which has been really made clear, is that it doesn't connect with the antique forms and it doesn't belong there, but it's another strain of karate, another
branch.
Yes, it's a development, isn't it? It's an art in itself, and a very highly skilled art in and of itself. But it's important to not mix up all of these things to keep them not pure but functional. And that's what we're really interested in is the function of things and what the origins and meanings of these things were.
I think I make one more contribution here, one more statement, and that is that the modern karate and so if we look at styles like Shukokai and and Wadaru, who really did embrace sparring big time, along with Shotokan, who was the kind of brand giant. The thing about all of this is it's you can do it when you're young, and you will like any sport. It's never. Well, I'm personally, I'll just say personally, never comfortable to see 40-year-olds plus in a boxing ring. I wish them well, but it never makes me comfortable. So we need to understand that the athletic, the sparring side of karate is an athletic pursuit, but the classical karate is something different. The pursuit of kata and its application can yield can provide a longevity. It lasts. It can be done happily and comfortably into old age. And the fact that there is no competitive sparring or competitive element whatsoever in the original version, the original kata, and their purpose, then the art can truly create masters and create people who have experience, ability, and skill into advanced age. So, hence, Funikoshi Jichin. Wow, he was a karate master. I think he was 90. I probably get this wrong. 92 when he passed. But karate has this reputation for old masters. I mean, that's pretty encouraging, and it's a lot nicer than what happens to people in competitive, generally in competitive sports. And there's a dignity to it, and I think that's one of the attractive components of karate. Is it has a sense and degree of nobility.
So the takeaway is clear. Modern sparring and antique kata are two completely different arts. While sparring is a highly skilled athletic pursuit, the classical forms were built for a different function, one based on preemption, not exchange. Thanks for joining us on Great Karate Myths. If this episode made you rethink your training, share it with a training partner and subscribe for more deep dives. Thanks for joining us. Until next time.